And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we continue looking at examples of the full model, long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. And in this example, we're going to assume that the role of government is going to be that the government is going to not respond. So the government will have no response to the economic events that are taking place. So they're just going to stay out of the way, laissez-faire, and let things play out. So we start with the macroeconomy in equilibrium, where we got an equilibrium price level, an equilibrium gross domestic product, equilibrium level of unemployment, all that sort of thing. And now we're going to say that my real-world event is we're going to get a significant increase in the price of oil, a significant increase in the price of oil. So what we're looking at here is an example of the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting first. So all the examples that we've done before this one have been the aggregate demand curve shifting and then getting back to equilibrium either through the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting us back or the aggregate demand curve shifting us back, depending if you're a classical or Keynesian policy. But now what we're going, but always in those examples, the aggregate demand curve shifted first. Now we're going to look at an example where the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts first. So we get an increase in the price of oil, and the increase in the price of oil is going to raise the cost of doing business, and we called that my determinant is a negative supply shock. You go back and look at your and look at the determinants on an earlier video on the determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is a negative supply shock. And that's going to raise the cost of business and cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift in to the left. The short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift in to the left. Sorry about that. Short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift into the left. Now, when that short-run aggregate supply curve shifts into the left, that's going to, the goods and services being produced are going to decline, and that's going to raise prices. And so the price level is going to begin to rise in the marketplace. So, all right, aggregate supply story, which is going to be a shifting the curve story, is going to be the negative supply shock. So here we get the negative supply shock is going to be our story, negative supply shock, and that causes, as we said, prices to begin to rise, and as prices rise, we're going to move along the aggregate demand curve. We're going to move along the aggregate demand curve. As we move along the aggregate demand curve, that's what that means is that as companies produce fewer goods and services, that means that the price of goods and services are going to rise, and as prices go up, okay, now you're back into that international trade effect or interest rate effect or wealth effect. All three of those you could use for moving along the curve. Let's do the let's use the interest rate effect. We haven't done that for a while. So if prices go up, that means people will not be able to save as much as they did before because they need their income to buy these more expensive goods and services. So people will not be able to save as much. Interest rates, as a result, will go up. So that will cause an increase in interest rates. And higher interest rates will cause a decrease in investment that's moving along the aggregate demand curve. You could have also argued the wealth effect here, and you could have also argued the international trade effect. All of those would have had the same effect. You would get a decreased consumption, decreased investment, and decrease in net exports. Okay? Either way, we're moving back along the aggregate demand curve. People are spending less, and gross domestic product is going to fall. Okay? Gross domestic product is going to fall. Now, the final conclusion here is we get prices are going up, gross domestic product is going down, and unemployment is going to rise. So this is really a tough problem because we really have two big problems right here, and that is that we both have a recession and inflation at the same time. And I think we used this word before in a previous video, but if just in case we didn't, this is what we call stagnation. This is stagnation. The The stag part means the economy is stagnant and we have inflation. So stagnation is the term that we use to describe that. Now, if the government is not going to respond to any of this, this is very much of a classical position. Government's going to stay out of the way. So what will happen? Well, unemployment is the key. Unemployment's going to rise. So that's going to become my new real world event. Increase unemployment. Increase unemployment means that there's going to be a surplus of workers out there who are looking for work, who are unemployed, and that means that's going to put downward pressure on wages. So my determinant is going to be change in wages. So wages begin to fall. As wages begin to fall, okay, so now we're going to get a decrease in wages. That means companies are going to be willing to start hiring more people again. So it's going to be over here, my short run aggregate supply story is going to be decreasing wages. Wages go down, and that means companies will increase hiring. They'll be willing to hire more people, and if they're willing to hire more people, that means production is going to begin to rise. So as production begins to rise, that short run aggregate supply curve is now going to shift back to the right again. That short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift back to the right. And when it shifts to the right, let's record that. Short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. And when it shifts to the right, now prices, as we begin to increase production, prices are going to go going to start coming down. As companies begin producing more again, more goods and services available, prices are naturally going to fall. What does that mean for the aggregate demand story? Well, that means now prices are going to begin to decline, and that means now the opposite is going to happen. Now people don't need as much money to buy their goods and services. They can save more, which means interest rates are going to decline, and that means that there will be an increase in investment. That means more spending moving along the aggregate demand curve. Of course, we also could have said here that consumption would have gone up because of the wealth effect. Net exports would have gone up because of the international trade effect. All three of those are happening. What happens from beginning to end? From beginning to end, now we're going to get prices return to where they started. Gross domestic product returns to where it started. And unemployment returns to where it started. So if the government, from the classical point of view, if the government just stays out of the way, the economy will fix itself. The economy will self-regulate. So this is an example of the short-run aggregate supply curve knocking us out of equilibrium, and then the short-run aggregate supply getting us back to equilibrium. The short-run aggregate supply getting us back to equilibrium. All right, this has been another podcast with Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.